I continue a series of videos from countries that were part of the former Yugoslavia. Today we have Montenegro, the smallest of the Yugoslav republics, next in line. Today we will have a short walk around the center of Kotor, and we will talk about how Montenegro developed and became. What events took place here during the collapse of Yugoslavia and why Montenegro took the vector of development towards the European Union and joined NATO, leaving Russia's interest on the sidelines. As we walk down the street, I will begin my story. At the same time, we will talk about Kotor. So, let us begin. The history of Yugoslavia in the 80s and 90s of the 20th century is very important for us. It shows us what we, born in the USSR, fortunately avoided. The collapse of the Soviet Union was almost bloodless except for a few conflicts on the outskirts of the former empire. But no full-scale war broke out between the former Soviet republics, with the exception of the current conflict in Ukraine. But here in the Balkans it happened. Montenegro was not affected by this civil war, which began after the collapse of the Union state. Unfortunately, in other republics like Croatia and Bosnia, as well as in Kosovo, everything went much worse. Montenegro was the last to leave Yugoslavia. And for a long time they, together with Serbia, remained alone in this empty house. The reason is also that historically Montenegro is Serbia. Montenegrins, as a South Slavic people, are a Serbian sub-ethnic group. For many centuries, Montenegro was part of various medieval Serbian states, and later most of the Serbs who did not want to put up with Turkish rule fled here to the mountains. When there was the Bosnian War, many Serbs left Sarajevo. Serbian houses were destroyed by the war, and the Serbs had no choice but to move to this quiet harbor. But let us go back a little historically. All these lands were formerly provinces of the Ottoman Empire, but in fact, already from the end of the 18th century, Montenegro was de facto independent. This happened almost 100 years before Serbia gained freedom during the liberation actions of the Russian Empire. Of course, the Orthodox principalities attracted the attention of Russia, which always considered Montenegro as one of its outposts in the Balkans. They did not like Turkish rule here and tried to disown Muslims as soon as possible. The Russian Empire helped Montenegro financially, was jealous of attempts to improve relations with other European states, and invariably attracted Montenegro as allies during military conflicts. During the Napoleonic Wars, Montenegrins fought in the Balkans against the French along with the Russian army, and their bravery was sung by Pushkin in his songs about the Western Slavs. This is what he wrote in the poem, Bonaparte and the Montenegrins. We have no desire to give up. Montenegrins are like that. We have stones and ditches for horses and infantry. We have settled into our holes, and are waiting for uninvited guests, so they entered the mountains, destroying everything around. Fun fact: out of allied feelings towards Russia, Montenegro declared war on Japan in 1904 during the Russo-Japanese War. But when the peace treaty was signed, Montenegro was simply forgotten, and it was formally at war with Japan until 2006. In addition to the joint struggle against the Turkish yoke, Montenegrins and Serbs are united by religion, common language, and some local residents even consider themselves mountain Serbs. Meanwhile, we approach the historical old center of Kotor. Kotor is the administrative, cultural and economic center of the Montenegrin coast, as well as a famous resort located at the foot of Mount Lovćen, on the shores of the unique Bay of Kotor. The Bay of Kotor itself is the main attraction of this area. It is one of the most inland parts of the Adriatic Sea, consisting of several small bays connected by narrow necks. Despite the fact that in the tourism sector Boka Kotorska is called the southernmost fjord in Europe, according to the latest scientific research, the bay is the remains of a river canyon that once existed here, which, however, does not in any way detract from the stunning beauty of the surroundings of Kotor. But let us get back to our story. We are now entering the old city. We have already passed the gate. This is the newest part of the Triple Gate. It was built in the 1830s. There are still fragments of the lifting mechanism left after the dismantling of the old bridge. The middle part of this gate is Romanesque. The passage to the city was built back in the 12th century. This is, incidentally, the oldest active city gate of Kotor, and is among the few surviving fragments of the city's fortification system from the Nemanjić period, a major dynasty in medieval Serbia. So let us continue. As I told you earlier, Montenegro united with Serbia in the 20th century, first as part of the Kingdom of Serbs and Croats and Slovenes, and then as part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And after the Second World War, already as part of a socialist state with the same name. The country, as we know, was called Yugoslavia. It was this socialist Yugoslavia that collapsed in the early 1990s, resulting in military conflicts in many of its former republics. Soon I will post episodes from Sarajevo on the channel, where I will also talk about the Bosnian War, which turned this prosperous city, which recently hosted the Winter Olympic Games in 1984, into ruins. Today we have a wonderful day and we have time to talk about this place a little more and more extensively. Moreover, our walk is wonderful and atmospheric, right in the center. Let us talk a little more about how Yugoslavia fell apart in general and how Montenegro managed to avoid a fratricidal war in the early 1990s. At the same time, Montenegro managed to hardly suffer from NATO bombing at the end of the millennium. But where is independent Montenegro heading today? Yugoslavia on paper was a federal state consisting of 6 republics except Montenegro. These were Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia and Slovenia. These republics differed from each other in level of development, national composition and religion. On the territory of the republics there were enclaves inhabited by people of other nationalities. For example, Kosovo was such an enclave. The autonomous region was located on the territory of Serbia, and predominantly Albanians lived in it. In addition, almost all the inhabitants of Kosovo were Muslims, surrounded by Orthodox Serbia. On the contrary, Serbian enclaves existed inside Bosnia and Croatia. This design ultimately proved unstable and the collapse led to 3 destructive wars. Montenegro, by the way, is also not the simplest republic and the national composition has never been homogeneous. There are Albanians living on the border with Albania, and some of the coastal territories historically gravitate more towards Catholic Slavic Croatia. There are Muslim Slavs living in the mountains, related to the Bosnians. Finally, even among the predominant population, some consider themselves Montenegrins, and others Serbs. And this is more a matter of self-identification than ethnicity. It often happens that the father calls himself a Serb, and the son a Montenegrin. This entire complex system with the mixed population of Yugoslavia was largely maintained artificially. But now we have already gone deeper into the city of Kotor. What is he like? While we are walking along the old streets of Old Kotor, I want to draw your attention to its period, which was the city before Serbian rule. The history of settlements in the Bay of Kotor begins in very ancient times. Various tools and pottery were found in the caves of the surrounding mountains, indicating that man had lived in these places since the Neolithic period, as indicated by the drawings on the walls of the cave in Liptsi. In ancient times, Illyrian tribes lived here. The Romans began conquering these lands in the 3rd century BC, and Rome ruled here from 168 BC, and after his fall in 476, his successor was Byzantium. It was then that Kotor was first mentioned. At that time it belonged to the ancient Roman province of Dalmatia. In subsequent years, Kotor became the center of the Bay of Kotor, which is why the bay bears his name. During Byzantine rule, the city was called Kotor, that is, a city rich in hot springs. The name of the city, Decatera, in the language of the Romans means narrowed and surrounded, since the sea bay cuts into the land in the form of a tongue for 20 miles, and the city itself is at its end. In 535, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian built a fortress over the city. The second city, called Lower, arose on the surrounding hills only in the 10th century. In 840, the city was sacked by Arab pirates based in Sicily and Crete and raiding cities on the Adriatic coast. Byzantine rule in Kotor was interrupted several times. So, in 1002 the city was occupied by the First Bulgarian Kingdom, but the following year the Bulgarian Tsar Samuil ceded Kotor to Serbia. However, the townspeople rebelled in alliance with the Croatian Dubrovnik, and after some time the power of Byzantium was restored. In the middle of the 11th century, the city was ruled for some time by a representative of the local Slavic Voislavljević dynasty. Until the 11th century, Kotor was mainly a Romance-speaking city where the Dalmatian language was spoken. Since then, the city, already known under the Italian name, Cattaro, has become one of the most significant Dalmatian cities for many years. Byzantium ruled Kotor until 1185. Already in the Serbian period, transformations began. In 1185 the great Jupan Serbia Stefan Nemanjić, founder of the Serbian royal dynasty of Nem-Anja, during the campaign to annex the lands into Serbia, triumphantly entered Kotor, which surrendered to him without a fight. The prince spared the city and built a majestic fortress in it. Kotor became part of Serbia as a vassal state, maintaining intact its institutions of power and its right to make peace and declare war. At that time, the residence of a bishop was already located here, and in the 13th century Dominican and Franciscan monasteries were founded. In 1241, during the Mongol-Tatar invasion of Europe, one of the armies led by the Mongol commander Kadin, grandson of Genghis Khan, besieged Kotor and burned it, but the city quickly recovered. From 1185 to 1371, Kotor was an important trade and craft center of the medieval Serbian state, a self-governing dependent republic specializing in maritime trade. Serbian princes and kings from the Nemanjić family maintained contact with Western Europe through Kotor and a number of other coastal cities. During this period, Kotor experienced significant economic and cultural growth. Its trade rivaled that of the nearby Dubrovnik Republic and was the envy of Venice. However, in 1371 the Nemanjić dynasty came to an end, and with it the Serbian rule in Kotor ended. Then the period of independence began for this city, but it will be short. Since 1371, for about half a century, Kotor and its surrounding lands have been a virtually independent urban patrician republic, although it officially recognizes the patronage of foreign monarchs. Until 1384, the ruler of Kotor is the King of Hungary and Croatia Louis I the Great. And already in 1391 the King of Bosnia was considered the ruler of Kotor Stepan Tvrtko I Kotormanić. From 1391 to 1420, Kotor was a completely independent aristocratic city-state, ruled by a prince elected by nobles. However, after the defeat of the Serbian army in 1389 at the Battle of Kosovo Polje, near modern Pristina, a Turkish conquest became more and more likely. Then the Venetian period begins for the city. Faced with the threat of invasion by the Ottoman Empire in 1420, the people of Kotor, in accordance with the decision of the Great City Council, voluntarily came under the control of the Venetian Republic and under its protection. From this moment on, the prince is no longer elected in the city. He is replaced by the governor of Venice. At the beginning of the 15th century, other significant cities on the Adriatic coast of Dalmatia, now the cities of Montenegro, came under Venetian protection. The city of Kotor was under Venetian rule until 1797. For almost 4 centuries, Kotor and the Bay of Kotor were part of a province of the Venetian Republic called Albania Veneta. These 4 centuries gave the city its typical Venetian architecture and still define its appearance. It is this architecture that can be seen on the territory of the old city.
Every day, they would come to take the water towards the laundry, so this little square became known as the gossip center.
Considering that almost the entire time of Venetian rule, Kotor and the Bay were a battlefield with the Ottoman Empire, whose possessions began several hours away from the city walls. This period can be called the most dramatic in the history of the city. The Turks were very persistent in their desire to capture Kotor, since control over it allowed them to control the entire bay, which at the end of the video I will show from the mountain. However, despite repeated attempts, the city was never conquered. So, in 1539, one of the best Turkish naval commanders, Admiral Barbarossa Kizir Hayreddin Pasha, with a large fleet and 30,000 soldiers, besieged the city from the sea, but after 4 days of the siege he was forced to retreat. In 1571, the Turkish fleet under the command of Ali Pash in Mudes in Zad-e, which was later defeated at Lepanto, besieged Kotor for a whole week, but had no success. However, the most difficult siege is considered to be in 1657, during the Cretan War between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed Pasha Varlik besieged Kotor with an army of 5,000 soldiers, who were opposed by an armed city guard of only 1,000 people. The siege lasted 2 months, but the Turks failed to take the city. Possessing a powerful fleet numbering about 300 ships in the 18th century, the Bay of Kotor was a serious naval force. Throughout the 16th century, the Turks regularly sailed here in the hope of conquering these lands, but the Christian fleet always gave them a worthy rebuff. In 1657, during the Cretan War between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire, many Orthodox Christians took refuge in Kotor from the Turkish invasion. The Venetian city administration allowed them to use the Church of St. Luke for Orthodox rites, so it has 2 altars, Catholic and Orthodox. Services for both rites were carried out for 150 years, until the French occupation of the city. Meanwhile, we just reached the main shrine of the churches of Montenegro. This Church of St. Luke, it's on the right. A very old building. Once in this church, tourists can see the unusual floor, which is made from tombstones. This is because 100 years ago, citizens were buried here, right in the temple. As I already said, the church was originally built as a Catholic church, but during the next war between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire, many civilians hid under the cover of the fortress walls of Kotor. Among them there were many Orthodox Christians, and since 1652 it was allowed to hold Orthodox services in the church in addition to Catholic ones. And at the beginning of the 19th century the church finally became Orthodox, and remains the same to this day. There are relics of St. Luke here. But the Turks were not the only disaster threatening the city. He suffered no less from natural disasters such as epidemics and earthquakes. In addition, Kotor was subject to earthquakes, and was almost completely destroyed by the Great Earthquake April 6, 1667. 2/3 of all buildings were destroyed, including the bell tower of the Cathedral of St. Tryphon. The Venetian governor and his entire family died. However, after all the misfortunes, Kotor rose again and was rebuilt. The Napoleonic Wars also affected this region. By the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, the city passed from Venice to the Austrian Habsburg monarchy, but in 1805, by the Treaty of Presburg, it was transferred to the Kingdom of Italy as a vassal of Napoleon's French Empire. For residents of coastal cities, the French occupation was extremely undesirable, since they lived primarily on overseas trade, and Napoleon at that time was at war with England, the mistress of the seas. The transfer of Kotor and the surrounding lands to the control of France meant the transformation of all Kotor ships into potential war booty of the British fleet, the blocking of all Mediterranean ports under English control for them, and the complete impossibility of further trade. Therefore, the inhabitants of the bay sent for help to the ruler of Montenegro, Peter Petrovic Njegos in Cetinje, who in turn sent a message to the island of Corfu. The commander of the Mediterranean expedition of the Russian fleet, Admiral Dmitry Senyavin. In February 1806, Russian ships and Montenegrin detachments occupied the cities of the bay, including on February 28, a Russian squadron approached Kotor. On March 2, the Austrians handed over the city to representatives of Admiral Senyavin. Local Montenegrins immediately swore allegiance to Russian Emperor Alexander I. The expelled Austrian garrisons were transported home on small ships. The joy of the city residents knew no bounds. Montenegrins cried with joy, Russian sailors were kissed, hugged, showered with flowers, and the hem of their dresses was kissed. The Russian ships were decorated with flags and, together with all 8 forts, fired a 101-shot salute. Throughout the region, cannon and rifle fire could be heard, all day long, until late at night, as a sign of joy. Not only local merchant ships, but also all houses and boats were decorated with St. Andrew's flags. A description of the city made by expedition member Bronevsky in his memoirs has been preserved. Having not yet seen the fortifications, one look at Kotor is terrifying. A high, almost falling rock, surrounded by stone walls, fortified in an inimitable way along ravines and excessive steepness. The fortress seems to be lowered into a cauldron, over which bare mountains stand leaning. A castle is visible at the top. To look at it, you need to bend your head back and look up. The city was built at the foot of a mountain near the sea. After further joint military successes of the Russians and Montenegrins, Metropolitan Petar Petrovic Njegos turned to Alexander I with a proposal to create a Slavic Serbian state under the protectorate of Russia with its center in Dubrovnik, which would include Kotor. But the defeat of Russian troops near Friedland on June 2, 1807 led to the Peace of Tilsit, according to which the Russian Tsar ceded the Bay of Kotor to Napoleon. Just like that, the Russians said goodbye to these lands. On July 25, Admiral Senyavin received the royal order to surrender the province and the city to the French. The evacuation of Russian naval and ground forces was completed by August 14, 1807. Russian warships stayed here for about a year and a half. After the Russians left, the French controlled the city until 1813, and in 1810 Kotor was annexed to the Illyrian provinces of the French Empire. In September 1813, Metropolitan Petar Petrovic Njegos took possession of the entire Bay of Kotor, including Kotor, with his own forces. At the assembly in the village of Dobroda, a decision was made to annex the coast to Montenegro as part of the temporary region of the two united autonomous regions of Montenegro and Boka Kotorska. In 1814, Peter Petrovic Njagos, as a supporter of Yugoslav unity, again turned to Alexander I with a request to accept Montenegro under the protection of Russia, but the emperor asked the Montenegrins to leave Boka Kotorska, which had passed to Austria by decision of the Congress of Vienna. On May 1, 1814, the Montenegrins left Kotor, losing their hard-won access to the sea. After this, the Austrian period began for these lands. As part of Austria-Hungary, Kotor was part of the Kingdom of Dalmatia, and remained under Austrian rule from 1814 until 1918. During more than 100 years of Austrian rule in Kotor and its surroundings, there were many riots and uprisings among the local population. Thus, in 1869, when trying to introduce compulsory military service in the Austrian army in Krivashia, a mountain plateau on the western spur of Mount Oren, an uprising of local residents of the Orthodox faith broke out. The rebellion was suppressed by the forces of the Austrian Expeditionary Force, but the government of Austria-Hungary was forced to abandon the idea of universal conscription. But it was eventually reintroduced in 1881, leading to a new revolt among the Orthodox population, which was also suppressed. After this, Austria began a large-scale reconstruction of the military harbor in the bay, trying to make it invulnerable from a possible attack by the Russians or Montenegrins. On the other hand, the period of Austrian domination in the Bay of Kotor also became a time of rise of Slavic national consciousness. In Kotor in the 19th century, various Serbian societies were constantly founded and Serbian institutions were opened. For example, in 1838 the Palace of the Serbian Assembly with a library, in 1848 the Serbian Folk School under the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church, in 1862 the Serbian National Guard, and so on. In 1874, the Kotor Dubrovnik Episcopate of the Serbian Orthodox Church was established in Kotor, and in 1909 the Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas was opened, the first Orthodox church in the city since 1657, when services according to the Orthodox Rite began in the Church of St. Luke. In the First World War, Kotor was the scene of fierce battles between Montenegro and Austria-Hungary. On February 3, 1918, the Kotor uprising of sailors of the Austro-Hungarian fleet took place here. The crews of 40 ships located in the Bay of Kotor, about 6,000 sailors, Croats, Slovenes, Czechs, Hungarians, and port workers rebelled. Having concentrated troops, the Austro-Hungarian command suppressed the uprising. About 800 people were arrested. The leaders of the uprising were shot. Since 1918, after the defeat of Austria-Hungary in the First World War, the city became part of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. From that moment on, the city began to be officially called Kotor. Until then the Italian version, Cataro, was adopted in documents. Until 1922, the Bay of Kotor was an independent district with its capital in Kotor, and in 1922 it became part of the Zeta region. In 1920, more than 100 years after Admiral Sinyavin's squadron, Russian ships again appeared in the Bay of Kotor, but now with the remnants of Baron Wrangel's army and Russian refugees. In hospitals opened in the Kotor area, refugees received medical care, and then settled throughout the kingdom. Russian ships returned here again, but this time fleeing the country and being persecuted by Soviet communists. A little later, after the surrender of Royal Yugoslavia during the Second World War in 1941, the city was occupied by Italian and German troops. Mussolini annexed the areas around Kotor along with other cities on the Montenegrin coast and incorporated them into Italy. All these lands were part of the Italian province of Dalmatia, and were called the province of Cataro. Kotor was liberated only in November 1944. At the end of the war, Kotor, as part of Montenegro, became part of the revived Yugoslavia, now communist. I said this at the very beginning of the video.
Çıkmayacağız buradan.
Çıkarsan buraya gidemezsin.
Dondurma ister misiniz? Dondurma. Herkes dondurma. Yemedik ki.
But soon we will leave the old city and go towards the bay, where ferries from Italy usually dock. This will be an occasion to talk about the future of Montenegro as part of Yugoslavia and modern Montenegro. According to the Union Constitution of Yugoslavia in 1974, 2 autonomous provinces were created in Serbia, Kosovo and Vojvodina. According to the logic of Broz Tito, according to which I will make an episode from Belgrade soon on the channel, the Serbian population in Croatia and Bosnia acted as a counterweight to the national aspirations of the Croats and their Bosnian Muslims, and the autonomous regions of Kosovo and Vojvodina restrained Serbian nationalism. In general, Broz Tito dreamed of the emergence of a new Yugoslav people, but, of course, nothing came of this idea. Just as it was not possible to create a national Soviet people in the USSR. For a while, the system of checks and balances worked at the very least, but later led to big problems. All these dissimilar republics were held together by the power of Broz Tito due to the lack of freedom of real federalism. The illusion of civil peace and tranquility was created in the country. In general, everything is approximately the same as it was in the USSR. In 1980, Broz Tito died, and the gradual process of disintegration of the Union state began. After Tito's death, power in Yugoslavia passed to the Presidium, which was led in turn by the heads of the republics. This led to an increase in nationalist sentiment, on top of which the economic crisis fell. Yugoslavia survived for many years thanks to loans from the International Monetary Fund, but in the 1980s financial assistance was reduced and the socialist economy proved unviable and began to collapse. Rising unemployment and the closure of unprofitable enterprises further fueled separatist sentiments. Rich republics like Slovenia and Croatia did not want to feed poorer areas like Kosovo. In 1986, Slobodan Milosevic became the head of the Serbian Communist Party. Yugoslavia at this time had already begun to burst at the seams, and Milosevic, who adhered to nationalist views, quickly gained popularity in Serbia. He advocated increasing the role of the Serbs throughout the federation and promised to protect their interests even on the territory of other republics. In many ways, it was Milosevic's pro-Serb position that led to the rise to power in Croatia and Bosnia of politicians who opposed Milosevic's views. He became one of the main initiators and culprits of the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, but problems began even earlier before he came to power. Already in 1981, the first clashes between Albanians and Serbs took place in Kosovo. As a result of those events, 12 people were killed. The conflict caused a rise in anti-Serbian sentiment throughout the rest of Yugoslavia. In 1986, a memorandum from the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts was published in a Belgrade newspaper. This is an openly nationalistic document. It spoke of discrimination against Serbs both in Bosnia and Croatia, and in Serbia itself, in Kosovo. It also contained reproaches against the late Broz Tito, a Croatian by nationality. The memorandum caused heated debate in Yugoslav society and, according to many scientists, greatly accelerated the collapse of the country. So here is a brief chronology of the collapse of Yugoslavia. Slovenia and Croatia were the first to declare independence on June 21, 1991. For both countries it was not bloodless. Slovenia got off relatively lightly. The war there lasted only 10 days. In Croatia, everything was a little more complicated. Active hostilities began. In December 1991, Macedonia seceded from Yugoslavia after a referendum. The Macedonians managed to leave peacefully, but they also received their share of hostilities later. In the spring of 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence. There was a big war with a lot of crimes and ethnic cleansing. To stop it, it was even necessary to resort to the not entirely legal intervention of NATO troops. This was the alliance's first military operation in its entire history. Thus, only two participants remained in the former Yugoslavia, Serbia-Montenegro. In April 1992, they transformed the collapsed Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia into the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Drawing analogies, it is as if after the collapse of the USSR, Russia and Belarus would create some kind of union state. Actually, this is partly what happened. The only difference is that our union state exists solely on paper with great differences in practice. And the Serbs and Montenegrins had a real federation with a common president and parliament, and other authorities. This unification fully corresponded to the mood of the Montenegrins. In 1992, 95% of the country's citizens voted in favor of a new union for Serbia in a referendum. The first president of Montenegro was Momir Milosevic, a longtime ally of Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. Both were major party functionaries back in socialist Yugoslavia. Only two of them out of the entire old guard managed to remain in power. In all other republics, new politicians came to power. Momir Milosevic supported Milosevic during the wars with Croatia and Bosnia, but Montenegro tried not to participate in them, hoping to avoid economic sanctions. There were no hostilities on the territory of the republic, and there is no destruction or other traces of war to be found here. This is a unique case for the former Yugoslavia. Everyone else was at least a little bit affected. Montenegro no. Momir Milosevic generally tried to maneuver. He created the illusion of Montenegro's desire for independence. He managed to get Italy to promise that the Italians would put in a good word for his country when joining the European Union. But then he abandoned this idea. Montenegrin society was too Serbian. Momir Milosevic simply would not have been understood by his own citizens. In 1999, Yugoslavia was bombed by NATO aircraft during the Kosovo crisis. Montenegro also suffered a little. Here in the capital Podgorica there was an insignificant military airfield, but the scale of destruction, of course, cannot be compared with the bombing of Serbia. Montenegro, one might say, was spared, and deliberately. Why did this happen? Despite the common history, language and religion, Montenegro is still not quite Serbia. Gradually, centrifugal forces made themselves felt here too. In 1998, Milo Đukanović, who had previously been the country's prime minister, became the president of Montenegro instead of Milosevic. He was a consistent opponent of the socialist Milosevic. Milo Đukanović condemned the NATO bombing, but this did not stop him from harshly criticizing Milosevic's policies in Kosovo and advocating strengthening relations with the West. Đukanović proclaimed a course for independence in Montenegro, and the country's entry into the European Union and NATO. Russia, meanwhile, reacts extremely weakly to these changes. After the Republic became a sovereign state, the goal for membership in these organizations was even stated in the Constitution. But even at that time, while the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia still existed, Montenegro had already begun to fence itself off from Serbia. For example, customs appeared at the border, and later Montenegro changed its currency, first to the German mark, and then to the euro. For this, the country was subjected to repression by Belgrade. Union President Milosevic actually imposed an economic blockade. There was even talk about the possibility of military intervention, but the defeat of the Yugoslav army by NATO aircraft made the invasion impossible. And Milosevic himself lost his post in 2000 as a result of the bulldozer revolution. Then, as we know, he went to the dock in The Hague. The democratization of Serbia made possible the next steps towards a civilized divorce between the two republics. In 2003, Yugoslavia was transformed into the Union of Serbia and Montenegro. It was already a very vague and weak confederation. And on May 21, 2006, in a referendum, 55% of Montenegrins even spoke in favor of leaving this union. In just 15 years, public opinion has completely changed and Montenegro has once again become an independent state. Yugoslavia finally ceased to exist in any form. The last republic separated from it bloodlessly and peacefully. Montenegro is today a parliamentary republic. The local unicameral parliament, the Assembly of Montenegro, approves the Prime Minister, the Prosecutor General, representatives of the Supreme and Cassation Courts, and the parliamentary majority forms the government. There is also a president in Montenegro, but he has rather representative functions. Now, by the way, the position of president is occupied by the young Jakov Milotovic, who is not even 40 years old. When talking about modern independent Montenegro, one cannot ignore the topic of relations between this country and Russia. Russia has always been treated well here. You can talk about historical ties, common religion, and so on, but it is important to emphasize the more everyday and human aspect. Montenegro is one of the favorite summer holiday destinations for Russians. Excellent climate, warm sea, friendly people, visa-free regime. What could be better? But the relationship between our countries has not been going through a good moment in recent years. Around 2012, former President Milo Đukanović began to actively drift towards NATO, after the Crimea incident occurred in 2014. Montenegro then joined the sanctions against Russia, and the most hellish story happened in 2016. Then, according to the Montenegrin authorities, an attempt at a coup d'état organized by employees of the Russian GRU was prevented. It happened like this. On October 16, 2016, on the day of the parliamentary elections, law enforcement agencies of Montenegro announced the detention of a terrorist group. According to the police, members of this group planned to enter the parliament building and organize riots in the street and provoke shooting, as well as physically eliminate Milo Đukanović. And he was prime minister at that moment. In total, up to 500 people were supposed to participate in the coup. As a result of these events, politicians from opposition parties were to seize power. The leader of this group, according to the Montenegrin authorities, were activists of Serbian nationalist movements, including those who fought in Donbass, as well as 2 Russian citizens. One of whom is a certain Eduard Shishmakov, hiding under the fictitious name Shirokov. According to the Montenegrin police, this is a former deputy military attaché in Poland. He had previously been expelled from Warsaw for espionage. The Russians were then sentenced in absentia to long prison terms. Both of them, according to the Montenegrin government, are high-ranking GRU officers. It was not possible to establish their location. The Russian government stated that it had nothing to do with this event, and that all this was part of some kind of internal political struggle in Montenegro. At the same time, Đukanović was added to the Russian sanctions lists, and one of the Serbs, who was accused of organizing the coup, received political asylum in Moscow. The media also reported that several Russian citizens were deported from Serbia with the wording, "for participation in the preparation of terrorist actions," and a few days after the allegedly planned coup, the secretary of the Russian Security Council Nikolai Patrushev urgently went to Belgrade, where he held closed meetings with all Serbian managers. In general, The story is quite strange. Write what you think about her. It is not very clear why the Montenegrin authorities needed this story. Montenegro at that moment was in the last stages of negotiations on joining NATO, and Russian indignation on this score is well known. For example, there is a similar situation in Georgia or Ukraine within the framework of preventing the alliance's military equipment from reaching Russia's borders. For example, there are territorial conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine, and joining NATO with such conflicts is unlikely. It was difficult to create such a conflict in Montenegro, but organizing unrest is already an open question. However, Montenegro joined NATO in 2017. It became the third republic of the former Yugoslavia to join the North Atlantic Alliance. Slovenia and Croatia had already done this before, but Montenegro has not yet joined the European Union. Although he has been striving for this for a very long time. And according to the plan highlighted in the media, this should happen in 2025. But personally, I have big doubts about this. Moreover, Montenegro will become a member of the European Union at the same time as Serbia. Why has such a historically close country to us become wary of Russia today? The answer to this question lies, I think, primarily in Russian foreign policy. Even though all the events take place thousands of kilometers from the Montenegrin borders, for the former and Yugoslav republics such behavior works like a red rag for a bull. Here they know very well the value of all the words that were spoken from the stands during the collapse of Yugoslavia. And I think there is a fear of a return of wars to these territories. The Serbs were returning their lands. As a result, the Serbs became a divided nation, living in several countries. These are all political parallels. In socialist Yugoslavia, Montenegro was considered a lagging republic, and today in terms of GDP per capita it is second only to Slovenia and Croatia. Having created such a small paradise on the Adriatic coast, it is unlikely that Montenegrins will want a return of wars to these lands. Today, Montenegro's GDP per capita is confidently ahead of Bosnia, Macedonia and even Serbia. Tourism has become the main driver of the development of Montenegro. The republic aims to become one of the main tourist destinations of the European Union. There is everything for this. Sea beaches, beautiful nature, historical sites, ski resorts. Prices are much lower than in Austria or France. The currency used is the euro, which is again very convenient for tourists coming here from other countries of the old world. In general, Montenegro will be fine, but what its relations with our Russia will be is not yet very clear. Russia has been helping all sorts of nationalist forces in Montenegro for a long time. In addition, there is a very strong connection between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church, of which Montenegrins are part. In 2020, parliamentary elections were held in Montenegro, and although Milo Đukanović's party won the largest number of seats, they failed to form a government and approve the candidacy of the prime minister. This happened for the first time in the entire existence of Montenegro. Considering that the next 3 seats were taken by opposition parties, including pro-Russian and pro-Serbian ones, we can talk about the defeat of Milo Đukanović. In 2023, he resigns as president of Montenegro, giving way to the young Jakov Milotović. And Jakov Milotović is already a representative of the new Montenegrin party, Movement Europe Now.
Давай, разворачивай.
There is also an opposition democratic front in Montenegro, focused on rapprochement with Russia. The first signs of a move towards rapprochement with Russia are visible right in the appeal court of Montenegro. He overturned the verdict in the case of the attempted coup in 2016. which was prepared by Serbian nationalists under the leadership of GRU officers, as the Montenegrins initially assured. Now the case will be sent for a new trial with the participation of other judges. Let us see how the situation develops in the future. Well, it's time for us to finish our walk around Kotor. As I promised you, we are now on an observation deck overlooking the entire bay. It's amazingly beautiful here. Kotor's past is rich in diversity of cultures, influences from different civilizations and periods of history. It has a rich heritage of medieval buildings, protective walls and fortifications, which make it a unique place in Montenegro and throughout southeastern Europe. Over time, the city experienced wars, cultural changes and economic difficulties, but retained its unique atmosphere and architectural richness. As for the future of Kotor, much depends on preserving its historical heritage and the ability to balance tourism with preserving the authenticity of the place. Development of infrastructure, support of cultural and historical initiatives, preservation of environmental sustainability. All this can help attract tourists, preserve the unique character of the city and improve the quality of life of its residents. Perhaps the future of Kotor will be focused on the development of sustainable tourism, the preservation and restoration of historical monuments, the development of cultural events and activities. This can help not only preserve its unique atmosphere, but also create new development opportunities for both local residents and visitors. Well, with this we will say goodbye to you. Be sure to rate this video, recommend it to your friends and forward it to each other. This will help the video show up better in YouTube searches. Well, as always, leave your comments under the video. Be sure to write how you liked or disliked the city of Kotor, and the areas in which we walked in general. Don't forget to watch other videos on my channel from other countries. And we will definitely see you in new episodes on the channel soon.